Go ahead and find your seat again. Or if you didn't like that one, find a new seat. We got plenty this morning. It's cold out there. So thanks for braving the cold. I think a lot of people are also sick right now. And so we can definitely be in prayer for people who are just feeling it this morning. So I have had the pleasure of visiting Israel twice, actually. And one of the most memorable times from my first visit to Israel was we were kind of, the whole trip was sort of focused on following the life of Jesus kind of more or less chronologically. And so visiting different locations and kind of, we had done even a lot of study beforehand, kind of going through the Gospels chronologically and things like that. But one of the moments, so when you're in a scenario like that, there's just so much to take in and so much information. And sometimes it all just kind of is a blur and you're just trying to take notes. You're trying to take it all in and it's kind of expensive to go to Israel. So there's that like what I call like Disneyland syndrome where it's like, this was expensive. You got to have fun. It's like we are all the way here on the other side of the world. Like I want to drink it in as much as I can. And so again, just sometimes it was great. It's an awesome learning experience, but it feels like you're trying to drink from a fire hydrant and it's just a lot. And so sometimes moments blur together. This one though, is exceptionally clear in my memory. Just one of those moments where all the information, all of the new kind of settled in and there was a focus moment. And it was this, we were in this space that was kind of generally in the location of where the upper room was. And so we're kind of at the tail end of our trip and at the tail end of Jesus's life and ministry. And so we walked out from that place and Jerusalem is kind of situated up on a hill. You walk down into the valley, and then you walk up on the neighboring hill, and that's where the Mount of Olives is. So we took this walk from being up kind of in Jerusalem, walked down into the valley, and over to the Mount of Olives. And that's what we'll see in the passage today. But as I got to do that, as I got to take that walk, there was something about that where I just felt the gravity and the heaviness of this moment, where Jesus is intentionally walking to his place, as Chad said last week, walking to the bullseye where, they knew he would be, and this was the spot where he was going to be arrested and kind of set off all of the rest of ultimately what would lead him to the cross. And so in a unique way, this moment is a moment of decision for Jesus. That he's going intentionally to this place to be arrested, to go to the cross. And it just felt, I was feeling the weight and the gravity of that. And coming off of our passage last week, it sounds like the way that Matthew writes this, that this conversation we're going to jump into happened probably while they're walking from this place over down in the valley and then up the other side of the neighboring hill into the Garden of Gethsemane. So that's where we're going to jump in. Matthew 26. So again, if we remember the last verses, it says they were gathering and celebrating the Passover. And it says they sang a hymn and they went out. So my guess, again, is that this conversation is happening as the group of Jesus and now the 11 disciples are walking over to the garden. So Matthew 26, verse 31, Jesus said to them, "Tonight, all of you will fall away because of me. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you to Galilee." Peter told him, "Even if everyone falls away because of you, I will never fall away." "Truly I tell you," Jesus said to him, "tonight, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. "Even if I have to die with you," Peter told him, "I will never deny you." And all the disciples said the same thing. So Jesus has been predicting his death. And we've seen that throughout the book of Matthew. And the disciples are trying to grapple with that. And now he kind of tells them another thing that's going to happen. And it's that they're all going to run away. And it's an uncomfortable thing to hear, I'm sure. Like, it'd be very uncomfortable to hear Jesus say, like, hey, you're all going to blow it tonight. And Peter is, as has been typical of his character, he's the one who kind of says what everybody's thinking. He just says it out loud. He's like, no way, I'm going to die with you. And all the disciples agree. And I think they really believe that. They really think like, no way, Jesus, we're in this with you. They don't want to admit that Jesus is right and they maybe aren't at the place that they think they are. That maybe there's something internally that their character is not as strong as they thought it was, that their commitment to Jesus maybe isn't as strong as they thought it was. And I just had this question, why is Jesus telling them this? Like, obviously we know he told them. We know what their reaction was. Why is he telling them? And this is what I think. And I think it's just this immediate picture of grace, that he wants them to know that when they blow it, he's not shocked. He already knows. He's certainly setting up some expectations for them, like, hey, this is going to happen, but they don't believe him, right? So what's the point? It's so that afterwards, after they have failed, that they know he already knew, and he still chose them. He knew they were going to do this, and he still chose them. And this felt very real and present to me, and maybe you can relate, because I think it's easy to look at a situation like this, or just to look around, in life at other people who maybe have made huge mistakes and be like, oh man, that's awful. I would never do that. I would never do that. I think we have to be very careful, because it certainly is very uncomfortable to acknowledge our capacity for sin. But if a human being has done something, so could I. I have the capacity to do the same thing. And this is the thing about pride, and I think what we're seeing on display here is pride from the disciples. Pride is this insidious voice inside that speaks two messages at the same time. The one message of pride is, I'm doing pretty good. Jesus, I'm doing pretty good, actually. It's like, hey, you're gonna blow it. No, I don't. That must be, you're thinking of that other guy. No, I'm doing pretty good. So pride says, I'm doing pretty good. I can kind of do this, Jesus. I think I'll do a good job, and then I'll come back and tell you how good I did. The other side of pride, though, says almost the opposite message. It says, I'm such a mess that in the face of my failures, when I have failed, I'm so bad that God couldn't love me. He couldn't forgive me. So one side of pride says, I'm good. I kind of deserve God's love. I've kind of earned this. And then the other side is, oh, I'm so terrible. God could never love me. He could never forgive me. And it's amazing as we look at the disciples. Again, and really the Gospels are written for us to put ourselves in the place of these disciples. And one of the things, actually, this is a bit of a side note, but I think it's important to highlight. One of the things that actually kind of bolsters the credibility of the Gospels is because the people who are writing themselves in the Gospels put themselves in a negative light, which is rare in general, especially rare in this time. And so we are invited with all of our mess and the way that we see the disciples struggling and being confused and missing the point. We're invited to take that same reality and find ourselves in the story. See, we're often shocked when we blow it, aren't we? Like maybe you were driving and somebody cut you off and something just flies out of your mouth and you're like, ooh, I can't believe I said that. Or whatever. It often, a lot of times it happens with our words. We say things, it's like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I just said that. That was terrible. Or just other times we do things like some kind of pressure gets applied and we do something sneaky or underhanded, or we kind of get greedy, or we just do things and we notice ourselves doing these behaviors, and then we're shocked that we did it. And it's just incredible because you would think that if we knew anything in life that we would know ourselves. But we seem to have even such a difficulty understanding even our own behaviors. It's like, why did I do that? We don't often know. And it's just, I don't know, it's incredible to me. And obviously Jesus knows us so much better than we know ourselves. He knows our hearts. He knows, the difficult things that we've experienced, the lies that we have embraced and believed that now cause us to live our lives in destructive ways, what caused that outburst. And he knows all of that stuff. He knows our hearts so well. So when he tells the disciples, hey, this is how this is going to go down, he knows. And so I think it's important for us to admit, and I think what the disciples are wrestling with even in this moment, is that as followers of Jesus, we need more grace than we ever imagined. And it feels so uncomfortable. We want to feel like, Jesus, I'm kind of earning this. I'm doing a good job. Yeah, I thank you for your love. I know your gift of salvation is free, but I'm kind of doing a good job now. The cross kind of got me in the door, but I got this. I got this now. And it's just uncomfortable and hard to admit to ourselves just how much forgiveness that we need, how much we rely on Jesus' grace. But I think it's a significant part of spiritual maturity. One of the simple, if you're like me, you need to simplify things so that you can remember them. And one of the ways that I have just kind of given myself a simple definition of what does it mean to be spiritually mature. What does spiritual maturity look like? I think one simple way of defining that would be to say we become more aware of our sinfulness, more aware of our need for grace and forgiveness, but at the same time, we become increasingly confident in Jesus' love for us, in the way that his grace and his forgiveness is greater than our sin. Both of those things increase. And I think that is a sign of spiritual maturity because a lot of times when we are kind of new in our faith, we recognize maybe initially that, wow, Jesus forgives all my sins, and that's amazing. But then once we're in relationship with Jesus, there can be this place of shame where it's like, I'm in relationship with Jesus and I'm still blowing it. And I've received his forgiveness for all of my past stuff, but now there's current stuff. And it feels so uncomfortable to grapple with the reality of our need for his grace and forgiveness. And so I think it's part of spiritual maturity to both just settle into the fact of I am a mess. And that's not my identity. I'm created to be a child of God. I'm created to bear his image. And he's working that out in me, but I'm not perfect. And I can recognize that his grace is sufficient for my imperfection. That his grace is actually applied to those places in my life already. And this is the beautiful thing that I don't think I had ever noticed in this passage before. That as Jesus is telling them that they're all going to run away, you're all going to abandon me, you're all going to deny me, he's already setting a meeting point. He said, when I've risen again, I'll go ahead of you and we'll meet up in Galilee. So Jesus not only knows that they are going to fail, but he's already set a plan for this is where we're going to reconnect. And it's not qualified by, and once you guys feel really, really sorry and you've kind of beat yourself up about it, then you can come. No, he's like, hey, this is going to happen and this is where we're going to meet up. I just think it shows so clearly the heart of Jesus. It's a beautiful picture of his grace and his desire to be with us. It's the reason why he is doing the things he's currently doing in this narrative. As he's intentionally walking to the cross, he is personally taking our sin on himself so that there would be no barrier for us and him, like to share in this relationship, so that we don't get stuck in our failures, but that we can take all of the reality of our life and just run to him. So let's continue verses 36 through 46. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane. He told his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And he took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, James and John. He began to be sorrowful and troubled. He said to them, "I'm deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and stay awake with me." Going a little farther, he fell face down and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." And you can see, even as we read this, that this seems like this is a significant, being here in this garden is a significant moment of, just reconfirming this decision for Jesus, that this is what he's going to do. He's going to go to the cross. So then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. He asked Peter, "So couldn't you stay awake with me 1 hour? Stay awake and pray so that you won't enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again, a second time he went away and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." He came again and found them sleeping because they could not keep their eyes open. After leaving them, he went away again and prayed a third time, saying the same thing once more. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? See, the time is near. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let's go. See, my betrayer is near." So Jesus invites his disciples, and specifically invites Peter and James and John to kind of join him in this moment of this really, it's hard for us to fully understand and put into words just how significant and difficult this moment is. But all of the Gospels highlight this moment. We see that in another gospel that Jesus is actually sweating drops of blood. Like this is an extremely intense moment. And he invites these three disciples to pray with him. And Jesus is doing like some significant just wrestling and spiritual battle in this moment. And these guys are having a difficult time engaging with reality. They cannot stay awake. And Luke specifically says that they were exhausted from grief. And I kind of understand that. I don't know if you've ever had moments that are just difficult, and maybe you've received some really hard news, and Jesus is telling them a lot of hard stuff. He's doing a lot of like teaching and encouragement, but he's also just emphasizing like, I am going to die and you guys are going to abandon me, and these kind of things. And so this is just difficult stuff. And I don't know in moments for you, like in difficult moments like this, but I certainly have had moments where I've maybe just received some hard news, or I'm wrestling with some difficult realities, and you just feel absolutely exhausted. You just feel like I have nothing left, like emotionally, and then even physically, just feeling exhausted. And this is where the disciples are at on this night. See, in this moment, Jesus is doing, again, this significant spiritual wrestling and battle. And just like Jesus faced kind of that threefold temptation in the wilderness, all those temptations aimed at, hey, you don't have to be this kind of Messiah. You don't have to do the suffering thing. Take a different route. It's the same thing that Jesus is again saying 3 times, "Not my will, but yours be done. I will go the way of the cross." And again, all Jesus would have to do at this moment, and this is part of the reason why it's such a significant moment of decision, is they didn't have, GPS tracking. He could have just walked a little further, like over the hill, and just walked away, and they would have never found him. But he stays here in this place because he knows this is where Judas knows he will be. So he has placed himself, as Chad said last week, right on the bullseye. And again, it's another picture of grace, Jesus and the disciples showing us that Jesus is praying even while we might be asleep. See, again, who is carrying this relationship? Who is the one who is actually fighting on our behalf? Certainly, we are called, like Jesus calls his disciples, hey, join with me. Join with me. Pray. And they may have actually prayed for a little bit. But the exhaustion sets in. They fall asleep. And even while they are sleeping, Jesus is laboring in prayer. While they are, potentially falling into temptation, he's remaining faithful, and it's the same for us. I know for a while I had a season where I was dealing with some pretty significant anxiety, and one of the things, and I was just having a super difficult time sleeping. And there, without going all into all of the reasons, one of the things I was recognizing was I was nervous to fall asleep because if I fell asleep, it's like giving up a certain amount of control. It's like, what could happen while I'm resting? And there is this place, and I think even in our relationship with Jesus, just to recognize, for the places where I am insufficient, for the places that I maybe am completely blind, for the places where I am spiritually asleep, or even like when I just physically rest or fall asleep, Jesus is still praying for me. It's part of his current ministry as he sits at the right hand of the Father. He is interceding for us. Jesus is not deterred by our inability to persevere through difficulty. He has this ability of still holding us, and his faithfulness helps us to actually stay faithful to him. So let's continue. Verses 47 through 56. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, suddenly arrived. A large mob with swords and clubs was with him from the chief priests and elders of the people. His betrayer had given them a sign, "The one I kiss, he's the one. Arrest him." So immediately he went up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. "Friend," Jesus asked, "why have you come?" What a gut punch of a question. Like, let's engage with the reality. What's going on right now? And they came up, they took hold of Jesus and arrested him. At that moment, one of those with Jesus, and we know this is Peter from the other Gospels, one of those with Jesus reached out his hand and drew his sword. He struck the high priest's servant and cut off his ear. Then Jesus told him, "Put your sword back in its place, because all who take up the sword will perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot call on my Father, and he will provide me here and now with more than 12 legions of angels? How then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say, it must happen this way?" At that time, Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come with swords and clubs as if I were a criminal to capture me? Every day I used to sit teaching in the temple, and you didn't arrest me. But all this has happened so that the writings of the prophet would be fulfilled." Then all the disciples deserted him and ran away. Now, one detail that we don't get here in Matthew, that we get in other Gospels, is that Jesus actually takes this ear and puts it back on. And it's obvious that Peter is just operating on a completely different wavelength from Jesus. And I found it very interesting. Again, another thing I hadn't really noticed before or put together is that Peter said to Jesus, "Hey, even if everybody else deserts you, I'm willing to die." And in this moment, it kind of seems like he is. Like he jumps up, he's the first one to pull out his sword and like, this isn't going to happen. And he's willing to put at least, I don't know if he thought that he was going to die. I mean, seems like there was a lot of people, like armed people there. So I don't know if he thought like, I'm gonna go out in a blaze of glory or whatever. But he certainly was willing to risk his life to some extent at this moment. And I don't know, again, maybe he thought the other disciples would jump in and help, and maybe they'd have I don't know what he was thinking particularly. But either way, he's going for it. And once again, just like when he said, "No, Lord," like earlier on when he's like, Jesus is telling him he would die, and he's like, "No, Jesus, this will never happen to you." Once again, he's standing in between Jesus and his mission to go to the cross. Peter's attempt to help Jesus is actually fighting against Jesus' mission. And I just wonder how often us, just like Peter, get real fired up and do things the exact wrong way. That in our, misplaced fervor, that we actually find ourselves, that we think, because Peter's like, I'm going to defend Jesus. And it's like he does the exact wrong thing. So he cuts off this guy's ear, and in John, we actually get his name. His name is Malchus. And Jesus puts it back on, and when Jesus tells Peter to put away his sword, it's at that point that Peter and all the disciples run away. And I was just like, why is that? Why is it that in this moment when Peter has a sword in his hand, he's like, I'll fight and possibly, I'm going to risk my life to do this. And then when Jesus says, no, we're not going to do it that way. We're going to go the way of sacrificial love. At that point, that's when it's like, no, that's too much. And I was just like, I don't know, it just brought up a big question in my mind. Why is that? What's the difference? Why is Peter willing to go out in a blaze of glory, but not willing to pick up a cross? Because I think we find those same things in our lives too. Why is it that I think there are a lot of people out there that are willing to die for what they believe in? But for some reason, the call of Jesus to pick up a cross and die a sacrificial or a death of sacrificial love, for some reason, people draw the line there. And I think for Peter, I was actually talking to my dad on the phone this morning, and I was telling him about this thing, this section, and I was like, you can see here that Peter is being propelled by what I would guess is just anger. He's angry. He's angry probably at Judas for betraying. He's angry that these people are coming and trying to take Jesus away. He's like, this is not going to happen. And so prompted by his emotions, he's lashing out. And my dad had some good insight. He was like, I think that they're probably in part what sparked that anger is maybe for Peter, his life is spinning out of control right now. And we all have different ways of responding when life feels out of control. But in this moment, Peter certainly is getting angry and reacting with violence to try to regain a sense of control. And I was like, wow, Dad, that's really good. Maybe you should preach this. But we all do reckless, unmeasured things that are driven by emotion. And when we feel angry or scared or whatever, we just react. And we do things out of those emotions. And in doing that, sometimes, again, we think we could even, in certain situations like this, we could even think that we're doing these things for God. I think we see these dynamics happen all the time in churches and ministries that are unhealthy and abusive environments, where people conflate the mission of Jesus with their church being big or something like that. And so now, people are not objects of love that you should sacrifice your life for. People are either on your team or they're against you. And leaders, it's just a consistent story that we hear over and over again. Leaders will lie and be sneaky and hide things, cover up, dominate people for the sake of ministry. And they leave a trail of ears behind them. And for us in this room, maybe some of us have had those experiences. Certainly just being in relationship with people, we can be wounded and hurt. But I think in a unique way, like in certain environments, people can really experience spiritual abuse. And I just love that we see Jesus come along and put this guy's ear back on. See, the way of Jesus is to submit our thoughts and our emotions to God. Because Jesus, obviously, he's feeling everything. It's intense in this garden. It's intense. But he's saying, not my will, but yours. And he's making an intentional choice, the difficult choice to love and to sacrifice. It's hard. It's hard because it means for me, in my life, if I follow the way of Jesus, I'm going to have to take a lot of shots. I'm just going to have to take it on the chin sometimes and not react, not lash out. In moments where things feel out of control, I'm going to have to trust the sovereignty of God. Now, it's not that we don't ever confront sin or evil, but it's very different if I do it out of anger versus I do it out of genuine love. Those who are parents, you understand this. You understand the difference, even how your discipline with your children looks if you are just angry and frustrated versus you're thinking about them and their future and how you want them to grow and develop as a person. It really changes the way that we approach relationships when we're motivated by a genuine sacrificial love for the other person. So let's continue. We'll finish this section, long section of scripture here. So stick with me. Jumping back in, verse 57. Those who had arrested Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had convened. Peter was following him at a distance, right to the high priest's courtyard. He went in and was sitting with the servants to see the outcome. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false testimony against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they could not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. So even people's lies about Jesus just weren't doing it. It was so obviously false. Finally, two who came forward stated, "This man said, I can destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days," which is not what he said. He said, "Destroy this temple," meaning his body, "and I'll rebuild it in 3 days," speaking of the resurrection. So they kind of twist his words. The high priest stood up and said to him, "Don't you have an answer to what these men are testifying against you?" And Jesus could have easily debunked that, easily. But Jesus kept silent. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." So Jesus' silence is just bothering them. They're like, "Dude, we're trying to figure this out. We're trying to cast a judgment here, and you're not giving us anything." Jesus says, verse 64, "You have said it," Jesus told him. "But I tell you, in the future, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." He kind of quotes or references in Daniel chapter 7 when Daniel gets this vision of kind of this everlasting kingdom of God. And the king, the Son of Man, the king who would establish this everlasting kingdom. So Jesus only speaks up to essentially kind of make sure that he goes to the cross. Verse 65, the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has blasphemed. Why do we still need witnesses? See, now you've heard the blasphemy. What is your decision?" They answered, "He deserves death." Then they spat in his face and beat him. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who was it that hit you?" Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A servant girl approached him and said, "You were with Jesus the Galilean too." But he denied it in front of everyone. "I don't know what you're talking about." When he had gone out to the gateway, another woman saw him and told those who were there, "This man was with Jesus the Nazarene." And again, he denied it with an oath, "I don't know the man." After a little while, those standing there approached and said to Peter, "You really are one of them, since even your accent gives you away." Then he started to curse and swear with an oath, "I don't know the man." Immediately, a rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. So there's kind of clear contrast that Jesus, in the midst of accusation, stays silent and except to speak in a way that would just make sure that hey, just so you guys know, these are the clear claims that I'm making, and yes, you're going to want to kill me for this. So Jesus is kind of making sure that they send him to the cross. Jesus could have gotten himself gotten himself out of this situation, certainly just by leaving the garden before he got arrested. And then as he said in the garden, like he could have called legions of angels to just wipe everybody out and just walk out of there like, I told you so. Or even in this case, like it seems like they couldn't come up with, even people who are lying, couldn't come up with good enough, convincing enough lies that it was working to like convict Jesus. And so he is sort of the one that intentionally speaks to make sure that they hear him say that he is the Messiah. And at the same time, while Jesus kind of remains silent and intentionally moves towards the cross, Peter speaks and defends himself to distance himself from Jesus and is willing to, lie. And he's the one giving false testimony to stay away from the persecution that Jesus is enduring. And so you just see this juxtaposition of how Jesus moves towards suffering. And if you're like me, I tend to do the Peter thing. I don't want to walk towards suffering. I want to distance myself. Maybe not always like directly from Jesus, but sometimes I definitely have. Because I don't want to be, thought of weirdly or, like just whatever. Like for very lame, minimal reasons, like not even real suffering. See, Jesus is the ultimate example for us of what it means to be human. He's the perfect human, fully God, fully man. He shows us what it means to bear God's image. And so more than anything else, what it means to bear God's image, what it means to be fully human, it looks like self-giving, sacrificial love. But if you're like me, we fail at this all the time. Instead of living lives that just express sacrificial love, loving Jesus and loving other people, I tend to love myself and my own life. And I tend to guard myself and run away from suffering and even decide not to associate with Jesus when there's sacrifice demanded. It's difficult to live life sacrificially. It's difficult to walk the way of suffering. I would say in our culture, the consistent message is part of the meaning of life, part of our purpose in life is to avoid suffering. That is how we find a good life, is by avoiding suffering. And I think that's so contrary to what the Bible says, that suffering is actually, it's a part of our life, and part of the purpose of our life is to carry our suffering well, to walk through it as a stewardship, and do it out of a motivation to love God and love other people, even with the way that we walk through difficult things or the way that we give of ourselves for other people. But it's the greatest commandment. It's what Jesus highlights as the greatest commandment, to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, that all of our life is sacrificially aimed in God's direction. As it says in Romans 12, that we lay down our lives as a living sacrifice, that is our spiritual act of worship, and that we would love our neighbor as ourself. That's difficult. None of us have done that perfectly. And here's the bottom line, and we have to settle this in our hearts. We have to allow the Holy Spirit to settle this in our hearts, that we are both saved by grace, which I think most people have an okay time accepting that. I'm saved by grace. I recognize that I have this weight of sin in my life that I can't cover it. I would have to pay for it. Jesus has paid for it. I can accept that. One of the things that I think is harder to accept is that I also persevere by grace. See, Jesus says the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. God's spirit can actually do this kind of stuff in our life. If we're trying to do these things by the flesh, it's not going to work. In Galatians, Paul is talking to this church that they had kind of picked up this works-based salvation thing, that they felt like they had to sort of follow some of these Jewish traditions to kind of be like really legit Christians. And Paul's like, having begun, he says this in Galatians 3, he says, having begun by the Spirit, are you now going to finish with the flesh? Like what God, the work that he did in you, now you have to complete it? No, we don't accomplish anything by the flesh. What we're called to do is to die to ourselves and allow God to live his life through us. And again, it's uncomfortable to accept that I have to be constantly receiving God's grace and his forgiveness for all of my shortcomings. Because it's in that place of receiving his grace and forgiveness that this work of sanctification, him actually transforming me to live these things out in an outward way in my life, to actually have a behavior in my life that reflects the reality of what he's done. It comes by receiving his grace again and again and again. It's part of the reason why we celebrate communion. It's a physical act of receiving God's grace again. Saying, God, just like I needed, like at the moment that I first gave my life to you, and I needed your grace and your forgiveness to cover me, I still continue to need that. Just like I ate food yesterday, I'm going to need some food today. I needed your grace yesterday, I need it just as much today. And ultimately, as we look at this whole story, Peter ends in this chapter just weeping bitterly. And I love that in the end of the book of John, we get this picture of Jesus meeting with him. Peter has gone, he's in Galilee. He's gone back to fishing. He's already met with the resurrected Jesus a couple times. Like Jesus has appeared to Peter and the disciples twice before this moment. So they know Jesus is alive. He's reconnected with them, but Peter is still like, I don't think I'm a disciple anymore. I'm just Peter the fisherman again. He's gone back to fishing. He has a significant moment with Jesus where Jesus meets him on the beach. He cooks him breakfast and he says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter's like, yeah. Okay, then feed my sheep. He asks him again, Peter, do you love me? Yeah, Lord, I love you. Then feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? And it says Peter was grieved because God asked him 3 times. And I just think he's like, okay, I denied him 3 times. He's given me 3 times to admit to him, and really probably Peter to admit to himself, like, yeah, Jesus, I still love you. Even with all these things that have happened, because of Jesus' faithfulness, because of who Jesus has been to Peter, Peter's like, even with all of that, I still love you. And Jesus so mercifully and graciously restores Peter. And so I invite the prayer team and the worship team to come up. But as we respond, I think we can find ourselves, it's not too difficult for us to identify with Peter and the disciples as they are struggling through this dynamic of we've blown it. We have, like, the only hope that we have is the grace and the forgiveness of Jesus. We've all failed. We've all sinned. We're all currently sinning. Like, we all have things in our life, like probably at some point today, if not already, you will do something that is displeasing to God. We all have failures ahead of us. So what do we do? What do we do with that uncomfortable reality? We throw ourselves on the grace of Jesus. He's paid the highest price. It's not a free kind of forgiveness. It's free to us. We receive it freely, but it wasn't free for him. He paid the ultimate price so that we can receive his grace, his forgiveness. And maybe we're recognizing that you've kind of felt like Peter. Felt disqualified, been standing at a distance. And Jesus has already, even before you failed, he's like, yeah, I know. I knew that was going to happen. That's why Scripture says, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. He knew that we weren't going to get it right. That is the whole point of the gospel. We could not be righteous on our own, that it's only by Jesus and his life and death, resurrection, and by him giving us the Holy Spirit that we can actually begin to live a new life. Jesus has already set a meeting point for you, and I believe that's today. It's right here. It's right now. There's nothing that you have to do to clean yourself up to earn it. You just come. You just boldly approach the throne of grace because that's what Jesus paid for. That Jesus wants to reconnect with you. Again, maybe you feel like you've been standing at a distance. You felt disqualified because of a failure, or because of multiple failures, because of a pattern of sin in your life. And Jesus wants to reconnect. He wants you to step into the grace and forgiveness that He has made available to you. So come for prayer. Come for prayer. You don't have to, read your whole list off. Just say, I just want to reconnect with Jesus today. Just receive some prayer and take that step of humility. Maybe you or somebody you know has had their ear chopped off. And you've been wounded by someone or by people who have professed Jesus, or you know somebody who's walked away because of those kind of things. And one of the consistent things that I just anchor myself to, especially as I see, some of my friends who have walked away from Jesus and are just angry about things, and I just pray, Jesus, would you heal them just like you did with this guy Malchus in this story? Even where Christians have failed, would you step in and be the healer? So would you come for yourself or for somebody else and just pray for God to do that kind of healing work? Maybe for some of us, as we've reflected, we recognize and we relate with Peter that a lot of our life and a lot of our decisions were kind of ruled and motivated by our emotions, and maybe, for a sense of control or, whatever that looks like in your life. But your behaviors have been motivated and controlled by your emotions. And you just recognize, like, man, Jesus, I feel convicted about that. I just need you to change that place in my heart. Would you come for prayer? Jesus said, those who have been forgiven much, love much. Part of the reason why I think we have a love deficiency in our churches at moments is because we think we've somehow earned it. When we recognize that we are just so dependent on Jesus' grace, man, it makes it very different when we need to extend that grace and forgiveness to other people. If Jesus gave up his rights to judge, if he said, hey, I've made a way that you can receive complete and total forgiveness from me. And don't get me wrong, there is a day coming that he will judge. He will judge, but he has made a way for us to receive forgiveness. When we recognize that, it makes it very different when we are called upon to extend grace and forgiveness to other people. So let's pray. Jesus, we just want to recognize the places where we just need you to do what only you can do in our hearts. And again, maybe it has to do with one of these categories I mentioned, but just anything, Lord, anything that you're doing in our hearts, we want to respond. We don't want to just stay where we're at, but we want to and be hearers of the word only. But we want to be hearers and doers. So would you help us to step into what you're inviting us into today? Pray this in Jesus' name. Let's stand and respond in worship. And if the Lord is leading, please be bold and come up to receive some prayer.